Chapter 1. What the city was built on. There is no rush here. Wherever you are listening from, you can let your shoulders fall now, and your eyes can close whenever they're ready. This is a story that has already happened. Nothing here needs your attention to unfold correctly. You can simply let it arrive. We begin not with a king, and not with a general, but with a hillside, and the women who were already standing on it when the story most people tell about Rome begins. Before there was a city worth fighting over, there was only a cluster of hills above a slow brown river, thick with sheep pasture and oak scrub, and a scattering of small, hard-working peoples who had lived there for longer than any of them could say. The Romans, when they finally had a name for themselves, were a new and rough arrival among older neighbors. The Sabines, up in the hill country to the northeast, chief among them. A young settlement of shepherds and refugees, mostly men, does not survive a single generation. It needs children, and children need mothers, and mothers in the ancient world needed to be asked for. Or, if a young city had made too many enemies too quickly to be asked for anything, taken. This is where the story of Roman women begins, and it is worth sitting with the discomfort of that beginning rather than rushing past it, because Rome itself never fully resolved it either. The Romans, tradition says, invited their neighbors to a great festival, games, sacrifices, the kind of gathering that drew whole families down from the hills for a day of feasting. The Sabines came, bringing their wives and their unmarried daughters, suspecting nothing. And at a signal, the Roman men seized the young women among the crowd and carried them off into the city, while the Sabine men, unarmed and outnumbered in that moment, could only watch their daughters and sisters disappear behind the new city's gates. We should say plainly what this was. It was a mass abduction, carried out under the cover of hospitality, and for many of the women taken, it was very likely also a forced marriage, a joining of bodies and households that these women had no say in. Roman writers, telling the story centuries later, worked hard to soften it, insisting the women were treated with unusual gentleness once inside the city, told they had been taken as wives and not as slaves, promised honor and property and a share in the city's fortune. Perhaps some of that softening even happened in individual households, in individual marriages. It does not undo what the day itself was. A city's founding story, in this case, is also the story of a crime against the women who had no part in deciding it. What makes this story endure, though, what earns it a place at the start of a series about Rome's women rather than a footnote in a story about Rome's men, is what came next. For a year, or perhaps two, an uneasy peace held. And then the Sabine fathers, having gathered their strength and their allies, marched on Rome to take their daughters back by force. War seemed certain, and it is here that the women placed at the center of the crime step, on their own initiative, into the center of the story. We may imagine the scene as later writers described it. The two armies drawn up and facing each other in the low ground between the hills, spears raised, the first charge only a breath away, when the women themselves, the same women who had been carried off, ran out between the two lines. They placed themselves and their children bodily between their husbands and their fathers, tradition says, tearing their hair and their garments, calling out that they would rather die there, struck down by both sides at once, than watch the men on either side of them. Husbands now, fathers still. kill one another over what had already been done and could not be undone. The armies stopped. Whatever historical memory lies beneath the legend, reworked for centuries by men eager to tell it as a triumph rather than a wound, the shape of the story is instructive. Women who had been given no voice in the crime that made them Roman found the only voice available to them afterward, and used it to prevent a second catastrophe from following the first. Peace was made. The two peoples merged into one city, with one of the Sabine women's own leaders, tradition says, sharing a throne alongside Rome's founder. This is our first motif, planted here at the very beginning, the room behind the room. Roman political life would always be conducted, formally, by men in public spaces, the field of battle, the assembly, and later the Senate House. But again and again in this series, the actual turning point of a crisis will happen somewhere else. In a household, in a doorway, in the space just outside the frame of the official record, where a woman with no formal standing does something that the men with all the formal standing in the world could not or would not do. Let's pause on something solid and plain before we go further, something to rest on. Rome, in this earliest period, was a walled settlement smaller than many modern neighborhoods, and its total population, women included, likely numbered only in the low thousands. For a few generations after the Sabine peace, the story dissolves into a long, half-legendary succession of kings. 7 of them, in the traditional count, ruling in turn over a slowly growing city, laying down its first laws, its first temples, its first roads out into the countryside. We will meet one of those kings properly in our next chapter, through the office he founded. For now, we let those reigns pass by the way Roman memory itself let most of them pass by, as a sequence of names, mostly unremarkable, until we reach the family that broke the whole system. The last king of Rome, tradition holds, was a man named Tarquin, remembered afterward, pointedly, and perhaps not entirely fairly, as the Proud. It was not Tarquin himself, however, who ended the age of kings. It was his son, and a woman named Lucretia. Lucretia was, by every account that survives, the picture of what Rome asked its married women to be. We may picture her on the night this story turns on. A group of young Roman noblemen, away from home on campaign, fell into an argument over whose wife was the most virtuous, and rode back into the city, unannounced, to settle it by simply observing their wives as they were, with no warning given. Other wives, tradition says, were found at a banquet, enjoying themselves in their husband's absence. Lucretia alone was found at home, late at night, still at her wool basket with her household women around her, spinning by lamplight. She won the contest outright. It is worth noticing, quietly, how much of a Roman woman's worth was measured in exactly this way, not by what she said or built or decided, but by what she was doing when nobody expected to be watching her. It was this same visit that placed Lucretia in the path of Sextus Tarquinius, the king's son, who returned some nights later, alone, and raped her. We will not narrate the act itself. It does not need to be seen to be understood, and dwelling on it would honor exactly the wrong part of the story. What matters, and what changed Rome permanently, is what Lucretia did afterward. She sent for her father and her husband, told them plainly what had happened, and who had done it, made them swear to avenge her, and then, before either man could stop her, took her own life with a knife she had carried in for the purpose. unwilling to let her name become an excuse for the crime committed against her, or a precedent for any other wife's forced silence. Her death, in the telling that has come down to us, was not the end of the story, but its detonation. A nobleman named Lucius Junius Brutus, present in the room, drew the knife from her body and swore over it that he would drive the entire royal family from Rome forever. Within days, tradition says, the monarchy that had ruled the city for roughly 250 years, call it something under 2,500 years ago, if you want a date to hang the moment on, was finished, and the Roman Republic began in its place. Notice what this means, sitting quietly at the hinge of Rome's entire political history. The single act most credited with ending Roman kingship and founding the Republic, the government that would eventually rule the known world, was performed not by a general or a senator, but by a woman with no formal power at all, choosing the one form of protest still available to her. The room behind the room again. Lucretia's memory did not fade quietly into Roman life. It hardened into an ideal, the univira, the one-man woman, the wife so identified with a single marriage that fidelity to it outlasted even her own life. You will hear this word again in this series, carved into stone over women whose actual lives were considerably more complicated than the epitaph allows. It is worth holding both truths at once. The ideal was real, and it was also a kind of cage, built partly from the memory of a woman who never asked to become anyone's standard. We leave this chapter here, at the true beginning of the Republic, with two motifs already planted in the space of one telling. The room behind the room, where women acted when public power failed them, and the univira stone, the standard against which every Roman wife afterward would be measured, fairly or not. There are others still to come. The covered litter that carried women through the city's streets, seen but never quite free to move as they pleased, and the wool basket itself, which we have already met tonight in Lucretia's own hands, and will meet again. For now, the city that had been built on an abduction has just been remade by a suicide, and it is settling, uneasily, into something new, a republic run by men that would spend the next several centuries occasionally remembering, in moments of crisis, that some of its most important turns had come from women it otherwise chose not to see. Before we go further into that republic, though, there is one household of women we have not yet properly visited, a small, quiet order of priestesses tending a fire that was never allowed to go out. Chapter 2. Keepers of the Flame. If Lucretia's household shows us one shape Roman womanhood could take, there was another, stranger shape running alongside it for the whole of Rome's history, older than the Republic itself, a small order of women who were, by law, almost nothing like ordinary Roman wives at all. Tradition credits Numa Pompilius, the second of Rome's legendary kings, with founding the order of the Vestal Virgins, sometime in the earliest decades of the city's life. Their charge was simple to state and immense in its implications: to keep a single fire, burning in a small round temple at the edge of the forum, from ever going out. The Romans believed that the fortune of the city itself, its safety, its harvests, the favor of its gods, depended on that flame continuing to burn, unbroken, year after year, generation after generation. A Vestal who let it die was understood, in Roman belief, to have endangered Rome itself, not merely failed at a chore. Girls were chosen for this service young, typically between the ages of 6 and 10, from among Rome's better families, and served for 30 years, 10 learning the duties, 10 performing them, 10 teaching the next generation. After which, in theory, a Vestal was free to leave and marry, though few, by all accounts, chose to. Here is the paradox worth sitting with. For those 30 years, a Vestal took a vow of chastity that, if broken, carried the harshest penalty Rome had. We will come to that shortly. And yet, in almost every other respect, a Vestal held a legal freedom no other Roman woman possessed. She was not under her father's authority, nor any husband's. She belonged to one of the very few classes of Roman women permitted to own property, make a will, and give testimony in court with a legal independence. Ordinary wives and daughters did not possess. She could pardon a condemned criminal simply by chancing to meet him in the street on his way to execution. The wills of Rome's most powerful men, including, in later centuries, the emperors themselves, were deposited for safekeeping in the house of the Vestals, because no house in Rome was considered more incorruptible. We may picture a single ordinary day inside that house, set back from the temple by only a few steps of stone. A young Vestal rising before dawn, walking in procession with 2 or 3 of her sisters down to a spring outside the city walls. Tradition names it Egeria's Spring, sacred to the same king who founded the order, to draw water in earthenware jars too fragile to set on the ground along the way, meaning the jars had to be carried the entire distance balanced on a ring atop the head, without ever touching earth. Back at the temple, the fire itself required constant, unglamorous tending. Dry wood laid in carefully, ash cleared, drafts watched. There were meal preparations for certain state sacrifices that only Vestal hands were permitted to make. There was the Palladium, an ancient image said to have been carried out of Troy itself, kept somewhere in the temple's inner sanctum, seen by no one outside the order, its exact location a secret the Vestals guarded for the whole of Rome's existence. This is our third motif for the series, and its clearest possible form. The room behind the room made literal. A chamber whose entire civic purpose depended on staying hidden, untouched, and unseen, tended by women who were simultaneously the most restricted and the most legally independent women in the whole of Rome. We should be honest, too, about what happened when the arrangement broke down. A Vestal accused of breaking her vow of chastity faced, under Roman religious law, live burial, sealed into an underground chamber with a small amount of bread, oil, and water, and left there. The Romans believed this method was chosen specifically because it avoided the shedding of a Vestal's blood, which their religion forbade outright, even in punishment. We will not narrate what came after the chamber was sealed. The fact and its reasoning are what matter here, not the imagining. It is worth noting, too, that such accusations tended to surface in moments of political crisis or military disaster. When Rome had suffered some defeat or bad omen the city urgently needed to explain, a Vestal's supposed impurity offered a tidy, terrible answer. Whether the charge reflected anything a given woman had actually done, or simply Rome's need for someone to blame, is a question the sources themselves rarely let us answer with confidence. Here is a grounding fact to rest on before we move further. The order of Vestal Virgins endured, essentially unbroken, for well over 1,000 years, from somewhere in Rome's legendary infancy, until the Christian emperor Theodosius finally disbanded it, close to the 4th century's end. It is tempting to read the Vestals as an anomaly, A strange exception carved out of an otherwise unmoving set of rules about what Roman women could be. It may be more accurate to read them as a demonstration of exactly how far Rome was willing to bend those rules, when the city's own safety, in its own belief, required it. A Vestal's freedom was never granted for her own sake. It was granted because Rome needed someone tending that fire whose loyalty could not be bought, distracted, or divided by a husband's household. And the price of that freedom, when the arrangement failed, fell on her alone. Not every Roman woman found her influence through a temple, of course. Most found it, if they found it at all, through the much more ordinary channel of a household and a family name, through raising sons who would go on to hold the offices she never could. It is to one such woman, and the sons she raised into the middle of the Republic's first great crisis, that we turn next. Chapter 3. Mother of the Gracchi. Not every Roman woman who shaped the Republic did it through a temple or through a single terrible night. Some did it slowly over decades in a garden with a stack of letters and 2 sons she had decided, long before either of them could walk, would matter to Rome. Cornelia was born into one of the Republic's great families. Her father, the general who had finally broken Carthage's hold on the western Mediterranean, a man whose name alone opened every door in Rome. She might have spent her life simply resting inside that inheritance. Instead, widowed relatively young, with a dozen children born and most of them lost to the ordinary, brutal mortality of the ancient world, she raised her 2 surviving sons and a daughter largely alone, and did something that Roman mothers were not, in general, expected to prioritize. She had them properly, seriously educated in Greek philosophy and rhetoric, to a standard usually reserved for the sons of Rome's most ambitious fathers. We may picture her, in the years this chapter is really about, in her villa on the bay near Misenum, where she kept a kind of open household for Rome's philosophers and Greek scholars, a woman in her middle age surrounded by books and by men considerably her intellectual equals, treated by all accounts as their equal in turn. We may imagine her at a writing table in that villa, reading over an early draft of a speech in her son's hand, marking a phrase here, softening an argument there, not merely a proud mother reading her boy's homework, but an editor whose judgment her sons visibly trusted and sought out. Here is a grounding fact worth resting on. Fragments of letters attributed to Cornelia, addressed directly to her sons, survived and were still being quoted by Roman writers more than a century later. An extraordinarily rare thing for any Roman woman's own words to do. Cornelia's sons were Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus, and what they did with the education she gave them eventually tore the Republic open. Tiberius, elected to the office of tribune, proposed a law to redistribute public land that wealthy families had, over generations, quietly absorbed into vast private estates, back into smaller farms for Rome's poorer citizens. It was, on its face, a modest reform. It was received by the families whose land it threatened as an existential attack on everything the Republic's elite had built. In the year the Romans themselves would come to remember as 133 BC, roughly 21.5 centuries ago now, Tiberius was killed by a mob of senators and their followers, clubbed to death in the streets near the very assembly where he had proposed his law. It was the first time in living Roman memory that domestic politics had ended in the murder of a sitting official on Roman soil, and the wound it opened never fully closed. We should be plain about what this was. Not a battle, not an execution under law, but a lynching of an elected Roman official by members of his own class, and it announced, more clearly than any single event before it, that the Republic's old habit of settling its disagreements through argument rather than violence had broken. Cornelia, by every surviving account, did not retreat from public life after her son's death, nor did she disown his politics to protect the rest of her family, as many in her position might have. A decade later, her younger son Gaius took up a version of the same reform program his brother had died for, was elected tribune in his own right, and pursued it with even greater ambition, only to be driven from Rome by an armed mob himself, and to die, along with several thousand of his supporters, in the violence that followed. Roman sources record that his own household slave, at Gaius's own instruction, delivered the final blow rather than let him fall into his enemy's hands. Cornelia outlived both of her sons by more than a decade, and if grief broke her, it did not break her publicly. She retired to a villa at Misenum, tradition says, and continued to receive scholars, to correspond, and, remarkably, given how thoroughly the two Gracchi brothers had been condemned and their memory suppressed by the families who had killed them, to speak of her sons without apology or retraction. When King Ptolemy of Egypt himself, tradition holds, offered to marry her, she declined. She had by then only one title she seems to have wanted attached to her name for the whole of the rest of Roman history, and Roman writers duly gave it to her. Not wife of anyone, but Mater Graecorum, mother of the Gracchi. It is worth noticing what Cornelia's story actually demonstrates about the limits of the civic ideal Rome held up for its women. She was permitted, even celebrated, for her learning, her letters, her household's intellectual reputation, precisely because all of it was framed as service to her sons' public careers, rather than a career of her own. Her power was real. It also ended exactly where her sons' bodies did. When Tiberius fell in that street, and Gaius fell a decade after him, there was no office, no vote, no formal standing of her own that Cornelia could fall back on to continue what they had started. She had built her influence entirely through others, because that was the only foundation Rome offered a woman to build on. And when both those others were killed, the foundation went with them. We began this series with the wool basket, in Lucretia's hands, as the emblem of quiet domestic virtue. Cornelia sat, in a sense, at the writing table instead, the same domestic sphere, extended as far as Roman convention would stretch it, into something closer to an intellectual salon. It is not a small distance from a wool basket to a philosopher's letters. It is also, notice, still confined to the same room behind the room, influence flowing outward from a household, never quite permitted to walk into the forum in its own name. The republic Cornelia's sons tried and failed to reform did not have much longer left in it. Within a century of Tiberius's death in that street, the old constitutional order would collapse entirely into a string of civil wars, fought this time not over land redistribution, but over who would rule what was rapidly becoming, in fact, if not yet in name, an empire. It is to one of the women who lived through the last and bloodiest of those civil wars, not a Roman woman at all as it happens, but the queen of an ancient kingdom on the Nile, that we turn next. Chapter 4. The Queen Rome chose to remember wrong. Before we go further, a note on how to listen to this chapter. Almost everything we think we know about the woman at its center comes down to us through the words of the people who defeated her, and who had every political reason to make her monstrous. Keep that at the edge of your attention as we go. This is as much a chapter about how a story gets told as it is about the woman the story claims to be about. Cleopatra was the last independent ruler of Egypt, a kingdom that had already been old when Rome was still a cluster of huts on 7 hills, and she came from a Greek dynasty, the Ptolemies, descended from one of Alexander the Great's own generals, that had governed Egypt for nearly 3 centuries by the time she was born. She was, by the account of nearly every ancient writer who described her, extraordinarily well educated, fluent in numerous languages, including, unusually for a Ptolemaic ruler, Egyptian itself, and she came to her throne alongside a younger brother she was married to in the Egyptian royal custom, at around 18 years old. In Egyptian and Ptolemaic royal tradition, the ruling queen was understood to be a living embodiment of the goddess Isis, not a metaphor exactly in Egyptian belief, but a genuine sacred office layered over the political one. It is worth holding this belief the same way we have held every other belief in this series, as something the people around her held to be true, not as something this narration asserts as fact. Cleopatra's political life became entangled with Rome almost from the start, at first out of necessity rather than ambition. Egypt's independence depended on staying useful to whichever Roman strongman currently held the most power in the Mediterranean. When Julius Caesar arrived in Alexandria pursuing a rival, Cleopatra, then locked in a civil war with her own brother for the throne, secured an audience with him, and, through his support, was restored to power. She later bore a son she named Caesarion, whom she publicly presented as Caesar's child, though Caesar never legally recognized him as an heir under Roman law. After Caesar's assassination, Rome fractured into a new civil war, this time between Caesar's designated heir, the young Octavian, and Caesar's most experienced general, Mark Antony. It was in this period that Cleopatra met Antony and staged the meeting that Roman writers would spend the following century turning into legend. According to the version of events that became famous, and we should be honest that it comes to us secondhand, written a century later by a Greek biographer working from earlier, now lost sources and shaped for maximum theatrical effect, Cleopatra sailed to meet Antony at Tarsus on a barge with gilded stern and purple sails, reclining on the deck, dressed as Venus, while attendants, costumed as mythological figures, rowed and fanned her, so that the whole city reportedly emptied out to watch her arrive. Whether the scene happened in anything like this form, we genuinely cannot say with confidence. What we can say is that it was designed, by whoever first told it this way, to cast Cleopatra as a seductress deliberately overwhelming a Roman general's judgment through spectacle and sensuality. Precisely the image Octavian's own propaganda machine needed, a few years later, to justify a war against a fellow Roman by recasting it as a war against a foreign queen who had supposedly ensnared him. We should pause here and name a Roman woman who does not usually get mentioned in the same breath as Cleopatra, though her story runs directly alongside it. Fulvia married in succession to 3 prominent Roman politicians, and, at the time of these events, Mark Antony's wife back in Italy, was herself no passing figure. While Antony was in the East, Fulvia raised troops, took an active hand in a political and military uprising against Octavian in Antony's name, and by some ancient accounts personally oversaw the siege of a fortified Italian town during the resulting conflict, a degree of direct command extraordinarily rare for any Roman woman, before or after her. She died before the wider civil war reached its end, and history has largely let her be eclipsed by the more colorful foreign queen who followed her into Antony's life. It is worth remembering in a series about women shaping Rome that a Roman matron and a foreign queen were, in these same years, both wielding real power through entirely different available channels, one through inherited spectacle and sacred kingship, the other through the household networks and political alliances a well-placed Roman wife could command. The war between Antony and Octavian that followed reached its decisive moment at the naval battle of Actium off the coast of Greece, in the year later reckoned as 31 BC, a little over 2,000 years ago now. Antony and Cleopatra's combined fleet was defeated, and the two of them fled back to Egypt with Octavian in slow pursuit. Within a year, with Octavian's forces at the gates of Alexandria, Antony took his own life, apparently believing a false report that Cleopatra had already died. Cleopatra herself died shortly after by her own hand, rather than be paraded through the streets of Rome as a captive in Octavian's triumph. The fate, we should say plainly, that Roman custom did impose on defeated enemies, and which she had every reasonable expectation of facing. The manner of her death has become, over 2,000 years, the single most famous detail of her entire life, and it is worth treating with real caution. The story that a poisonous snake was smuggled to her in a basket of figs comes to us from Roman sources writing after the fact. Sources with every incentive to give Octavian's conquered enemy a death fitting the exotic, dangerous image his propaganda had spent a decade building around her. Modern historians remain genuinely divided on whether this account is reliable at all, and some ancient sources themselves record uncertainty about exactly how she died. Only that she did, by her own choice, before Octavian could put her on display. Here is what deserves to survive the propaganda more clearly than the snake does. Cleopatra ruled Egypt in her own name, as a woman, for roughly 2 decades, in an era when almost no other kingdom bordering Rome was led by a woman at all, and she did it while playing an extraordinarily difficult hand. A wealthy but militarily overmatched kingdom, caught between competing Roman strongmen who each needed her resources, and each, eventually, threatened to simply take them. That she is remembered in the story Rome told about her, chiefly as a seductress who unmanned 2 of Rome's greatest generals, says considerably more about the anxieties of the men who wrote that story than it does about the woman it claims to describe. Her death marked more than the end of one queen's reign. With Egypt's fall, Octavian returned to Rome as the last man standing after a century of civil war, and within a few years, he would begin quietly reshaping the Republic's exhausted institutions into something new. He would take a new name, Augustus, and beside him, through the whole of that transformation, was a wife whose own story the following chapter belongs to. Chapter 5. The Woman Who Built an Age. We return now to Rome itself, and to a household that would spend the better part of a century quietly deciding how the empire passed from one ruler to the next, long before any law said it was allowed to. Livia Drusilla was married, at around 19 years old, to a Roman senator named Tiberius Claudius Nero, and by that marriage already had 1 son, and was pregnant with a second when Octavian, the same young heir whose rise we followed in the last chapter, not yet given the name Augustus, met her, and within a matter of months, arranged for her first husband to formally divorce her so that Octavian could marry her himself. Livia gave birth to her second son by her first husband, only days after her wedding to Octavian. A timeline so tight that even Roman writers, no strangers to political marriages of convenience, found it worth remarking on. It was not, whatever else it was, a marriage built around the univira ideal we met in this series' first chapter, and it is a useful reminder that the ideal and the reality it claimed to describe were never quite the same thing, even for the most celebrated Roman wife of them all. Whatever its beginning, the marriage endured for over 50 years, through the entire transformation of a shattered republic into something new. Octavian, having outlasted every rival from the civil wars, took the name Augustus and began, carefully and without ever quite calling it what it was, to build the office of emperor out of the republic's old institutions, leaving their names and their outward forms largely intact, while quietly hollowing out their independent power. Livia was beside him for the whole of this work, and by every account she was not merely a wife observing it, but a deliberate part of how it was presented to Rome. We may picture her, in this new arrangement, less as the mistress of a private household than as the architect of a public image Rome had never needed before, because Rome had never had anything quite like an emperor's household before. Augustus, keen to present his new order as a restoration of old Roman virtue rather than the seizure of power it largely was, held Livia up publicly as a model of exactly the traditional domestic virtues this series has already traced back to Lucretia's wool basket. Spinning wool herself, by tradition, well into her years as the most powerful woman in the Roman world, and wearing clothing she had woven with her own hands, at least on the occasions it suited the image being built around her. Here is a grounding fact worth resting on. A single room, uncovered by archaeologists in the 19th century, in what was once Livia's own villa outside Rome, contains a wall painting of an entire garden in full bloom, flowers, fruit trees, birds, that has survived in vivid color for roughly 2,000 years. A private world she apparently had built for herself indoors, regardless of season. The room behind the room, in Livia's case, extended well beyond garden walls. Roman writers, particularly those writing after her death and largely hostile to the dynasty she helped found, describe her as a constant, active political presence, advising Augustus directly on matters of state, and, in the later and more openly hostile tradition, arranging the deaths of rivals to her own son's succession through poison. We should be careful here. Almost every unexplained death in this family, across 3 generations, was eventually blamed on Livia by writers working decades after the fact, often with an obvious appetite for scandal and very little that would qualify as evidence today. Some of these accusations may hold a kernel of truth. Many of them almost certainly reflect Roman discomfort with a woman wielding real influence over imperial succession more than any specific crime she can be shown to have committed. What is not in serious dispute is the outcome all that scheming, real or invented, was said to serve. Livia's son from her first marriage, Tiberius, whom Augustus had been notably reluctant to name as his heir over other, more favored candidates, eventually did succeed Augustus as emperor, the first hereditary transfer of the new monarchical power Augustus had built, dressed the entire time in the Republic's borrowed clothing. Augustus himself, in his will, left Livia an honor no Roman woman had held before: adoption into his own family under the name Julia Augusta. Later, imperial memory would elevate her still further. Under Claudius, decades after her death, Livia was formally deified as Diva Augusta, joining the sacred language of the very dynasty she had helped build. Whatever we make of the poisoning rumors, this much is not disputed. The household Livia ran, and the image she embodied became the template every subsequent Roman empress, for the whole of the imperial period that followed, would be measured against, and frequently found wanting. It is worth pausing on the shape of what Livia actually achieved. She held no office. She commanded no legions. She could not vote, could not stand for election, could not, by Roman law, do almost anything that constituted formal political power. And yet, by the time she died at roughly 86 years old, in the year the Romans would come to reckon as 29 AD, very nearly 2,000 years ago now, she had spent more than half a century shaping, from inside a household, the single most consequential transition in Rome's political history. The quiet, careful invention of hereditary imperial rule out of a republic that had, in name, never stopped existing at all. The dynasty Livia had helped build did not age gracefully. Within a few decades of her death, the same household that had produced Augustus's careful, image-conscious rule would produce some of the most notorious courts in all of Roman memory. And it is inside one of those later courts, 2 generations on from Livia, that our next chapter takes place. Chapter 6. The Court and the Poison Cup. By the time this chapter opens, the household Livia had spent her life shaping had narrowed into something far more dangerous. A single family, the only family with a plausible claim to the throne, in which every marriage, every birth, and every unexplained death carried the weight of empire behind it. Agrippina the Younger was born into the very center of that family. A great-granddaughter of Augustus himself, sister to the Emperor Caligula, whose short and erratic reign ended in his assassination by his own guard. And, by the time this chapter's real story begins, a woman who had already survived exile, widowhood, and the routine background danger of simply being close enough to the throne to be seen as a threat to whoever currently sat on it. She married, as her third husband, her own uncle, the Emperor Claudius, a marriage that required a special act of the Senate to permit, since it fell outside what Roman law normally allowed, and which tells us plainly how much dynastic value Agrippina's own bloodline carried in its own right, independent of any husband. Claudius had been married before, to a woman named Messalina, whose own reputation for scandal and ruthless self-interest became so notorious in Roman memory that her name endures, unfairly or not, as a byword for imperial excess. She was executed on Claudius's order a short time before Agrippina became his wife. We mention her only in passing here, as one more woman this series cannot give a full chapter to, though her story deserves more than the caricature Roman writers reduced her to. Agrippina's central project, once married to Claudius, was securing the throne for her own son from an earlier marriage, a boy who would eventually take the name Nero over Claudius's own biological son. We may picture her, in the years this took, operating almost entirely through the mechanism this series keeps returning to, present at nearly every important moment of Claudius's court, but present specifically at its edges, arranging marriages, alliances, and adoptions from just outside the frame of the formal record, so that by the time Nero was formally adopted as Claudius's heir and married to Claudius's own daughter, the outcome looked, to contemporary Romans, less like a coup than an inevitability that had simply arrived. Here is a set piece worth picturing clearly, because it captures exactly how this kind of power actually operated. At a formal reception of a captured British chieftain's family, staged before Claudius on his tribunal to demonstrate Roman clemency and power together, ancient writers record that Agrippina had a second, separate dais built nearby, and presided over the ceremony from it herself, in open view of the assembled court and foreign dignitaries, a Roman woman claiming, publicly and without official title, a share of imperial ceremony no empress before her had claimed so visibly. It scandalized exactly the people it was meant to. Claudius died not long after, in the year later reckoned as 54 A.D. Roman writers, almost unanimously and largely after the fact, record that Agrippina poisoned him, reportedly through a dish of mushrooms, his favorite food, to ensure Nero's succession before Claudius could reconsider it. We should apply here the same caution this series has applied elsewhere. The accusation comes from historians writing under later emperors with their own reasons to blacken this family's memory, and Claudius, an older man in uncertain health, may simply have died. What is not in dispute is that his death, whatever its cause, arrived at precisely the moment that best served Agrippina's plans, and Roman opinion at the time and after was not inclined to call that a coincidence. For the first months of Nero's reign, Agrippina appears to have expected to rule, in practice, through her teenage son, and for a brief period, Roman coins were struck showing her face alongside his, granting her a level of visual prominence almost no Roman woman had ever received. It did not last. Nero, as he grew into the role and into the influence of his own advisors and later his own wife, moved steadily to push his mother out of the position of power she had built for both of them, and Agrippina, unwilling to simply withdraw, appears to have resisted that removal by every means she had left. What followed, in the year 59 A.D., is one of the most infamous episodes in all of Roman imperial history, and it deserves to be told plainly rather than dwelt on. According to the account preserved by the historian Tacitus, Nero first attempted to have his mother killed by means of a collapsible boat, designed to sink or crush her at sea in a way that could be explained afterward as an accident. Agrippina survived the collapse and swam to shore. Nero, informed she had survived, abandoned any pretense of an accidental death and sent soldiers directly to her villa, where they killed her outright. Tacitus records that she faced them without pleading, and that her final words, on realizing why they had come, were an instruction to strike the part of her body that had borne her son. We will let that stand as the full, honest account this event requires, and go no further into it. What matters beyond the killing itself is what it reveals about the shape of power Agrippina had actually built across her whole life. Real, consequential, capable of placing her own son on the throne of the known world, and, in the end, entirely dependent on that son's continued willingness to tolerate it. The moment he decided he no longer would, no law, no office, no formal standing protected her, because she had never been permitted to hold any in the first place. It is worth noticing, across both this chapter and Livia's before it, a pattern the series has now traced twice in direct succession. Two women, a generation apart, each building genuine influence over the same imperial household through patience, marriage, and the careful management of succession, and each ultimately as vulnerable as the men around them chose to let them be. The room behind the room offered real power. It never offered safety. The family Livia had founded, and Agrippina had fought to control, would not produce another emperor after Nero, whose reign ended in suicide less than a decade after his mother's death, and Rome's imperial households. From that point forward, largely learned to keep their women further from open view than this one ever quite managed. We leave the High Empire here and travel forward nearly 4 centuries to its long and difficult dusk, and to one more woman who found herself, like so many before her in this series, holding together something considerably larger than the power she was ever formally given to hold it with. Chapter 7, Holding the Dusk. We come, at last, to the end of this story, and to a woman whose entire life was spent holding together things that kept threatening to come apart in her hands. A husband's kingdom, a son's throne, an empire that was, by the time she was born, already well past its noon. Galla Placidia was born into the imperial family itself, a daughter of the Emperor Theodosius in the last years of the 4th century. At a moment when the Western Roman Empire her family ruled was already visibly struggling to hold its own borders. When she was still a young woman, the Visigothic king Alaric, after years of failed negotiation with the Western court, marched on Rome itself and, in the year the Romans reckoned as 410 AD, a little over 1600 years ago now, sacked the city that had not fallen to a foreign army in roughly 800 years. Galla Placidia was in Rome when it happened, and was taken by the Visigoths. Whether as captive or hostage, the sources themselves do not fully agree, when they withdrew southward afterward. We should pause on what this word, barbarian, which Roman writers used freely for the Visigoths and the other peoples pressing on the empire's borders in this period, actually meant in Roman usage. It did not describe a single people, a single language, or a single level of civilization. It was simply the Roman word for anyone outside the empire's own cultural boundary, applied as readily to sophisticated kingdoms with their own laws, courts, and Christian bishops as to smaller raiding bands. And it tells us more about how Rome saw the world by this point than it tells us about the actual peoples the word was pinned onto. What happened next says a great deal about how fluid, how genuinely mixed, the world of the late Western Empire had already become. Rather than being held simply as a prisoner, Galla Placidia was married, within a few years of her capture, to the Visigothic king Atholf, Alaric's successor. A marriage some ancient sources describe as one she entered willingly, even as a kind of bridge between two peoples the wars of the previous decade had left locked together, whether either side wanted it or not. We may picture the wedding itself, held, tradition says, in a Roman style, with Roman wedding songs sung by Gothic attendants for a Gothic king marrying a Roman princess. Two worlds that Roman writers preferred to describe as utterly separate, visibly, briefly, refusing to stay separate at all. The marriage did not last. Athalf was assassinated within 2 years, and the infant son Galla Placidia had borne him died in infancy shortly after. A loss the narration will note plainly, in the same register as the other quiet, common tragedies of childbirth and childhood mortality this series has touched on elsewhere, and will not dwell on further. She was eventually returned to Roman hands, under terms negotiated between the Visigoths and her own brother, the Western Emperor Honorius, and married a second time, to a Roman general named Constantius, who was shortly afterward raised to co-emperor alongside her brother. It was through this second marriage that Galla Placidia's real historical importance begins. Her son by Constantius, a boy given the name Valentinian, stood to inherit the Western throne. And when Constantius died only a few years into his own reign, and Galla Placidia's brother Honorius died without an heir of his own body a few years after that, it was Galla Placidia, not any general or senator, who secured the throne for her young son and governed the Western Empire as regent in his name for roughly a decade and a half, through his childhood and early adulthood. Here is a grounding fact worth resting on, plain and physical. Galla Placidia moved the practical seat of Western imperial government to Ravenna, a marshy coastal city protected by lagoons and defensible causeways rather than open walls. A choice that tells you, more clearly than any speech she might have given, what an emperor's family now most needed from a capital. Not grandeur, but shelter. We may picture her regency less as a single dramatic act than as an unglamorous, unbroken decade and a half of the same work this whole series keeps returning to. Balancing rival generals against each other, arranging marriages and alliances to buy the Western court a few more years of stability it could no longer generate through its own strength, holding together through patience and negotiation, rather than any army she personally commanded, an empire that every structural sign around her suggested was already coming apart. She did this work from exactly the position this series has traced from its very first chapter, without a formal office, without a legion, governing an empire in her son's name, because his name was the only name available to hold it together, while she supplied, from the room behind the throne, most of the actual judgment that kept it standing. One further set piece deserves a place here, because it says something quietly remarkable about how Galla Placidia's own age chose to remember her. At some point during her years in Ravenna, a small brick building, long associated with her name and known today as the Mausoleum of Galla Placidia, was raised. Modest from the outside, its interior covered floor to ceiling in a deep midnight blue mosaic scattered with gold stars, so dense and so carefully set that visitors, 16 centuries later, still describe stepping into it as stepping into a night sky that never moves. Whether she herself was ever buried there, and whether the building first served as a tomb at all, rather than a private chapel later linked to her memory, is genuinely uncertain, and historians remain divided. What survives regardless is the tradition itself, the idea, carried down across 16 centuries, of a woman who shaped how the last room in this story would be imagined. An act of authorship over memory that almost none of the women earlier in this series were ever granted, even in legend. Galla Placidia died in the year 450 AD, having outlived her son's childhood, secured his throne, and held the Western Empire together for longer than most of her contemporaries would likely have guessed possible, given how thin its foundations had already worn. She did not live to see its final end. Roughly a quarter of a century after her death, in 476 AD, the last Western emperor, a boy named Romulus Augustulus, was quietly deposed by a Germanic general who saw no further use in maintaining the fiction of a separate Western throne at all, and the Western Roman Empire that Galla Placidia had spent a decade and a half holding upright finally, without any single dramatic battle to mark the moment, simply stopped existing. We end here, at the same dusk the main history of this Rome ends at, though we have arrived at it, this time, from inside the story of a woman who spent her whole adult life doing exactly what nearly every woman in this series has done before her, holding real, consequential power through patience, marriage, negotiation, and sheer persistence, without ever once being handed the formal authority that would have made any of it secure. Before we close, let us walk back, briefly, through everything this series has carried with it from its very first chapter. We began with the wool basket, Lucretia at her loom, tested without warning and found faithful to an ideal that asked everything of her and gave her, in the end, only her name attached to a stone. We carried that basket forward into Cornelia's writing table, where the same domestic virtue stretched itself, by force of her own will, into something closer to a scholar's household. And we will meet it once more, briefly, in a queen far from Rome entirely, who spun and wove in her own hall while raising an army against the empire that had wronged her. Her name was Boudica, and though this series could not give her the chapter her own story deserves, she belongs in this room with the rest of these women all the same. We carried the Univira stone, the ideal of the one-husband woman, from the tombstones raised over Lucretia's memory, through Livia's carefully curated public image, into the quiet space where the ideal simply did not fit the more complicated lives so many of these women actually lived. It is worth remembering that ideal was always, in part, a cage built to measure women who mostly could not have matched it even if they had wanted to. We carried the litter, the covered chair, through Rome's crowded streets, seen in the crush of the forum crowds, but never permitted to walk freely through the spaces where formal power was exercised, in the same way that Fulvia, commanding troops in her own right during the last civil war of the Republic, was still, in the story Rome told about that war, folded quietly back into the role of merely Antony's wife. And there is another queen this room should hold, one further east and later still, Zenobia of Palmyra, who ruled her own breakaway empire against Rome's own legions for a handful of remarkable years in the crisis of the 3rd century, before Rome finally brought her, in chains of gold rather than iron by some accounts, back to the city she had defied. And we carried, more than any other single thread, the room behind the room, the space just outside the frame of the official record, where the Sabine women stepped between two armies, where Lucretia's death toppled a monarchy, where Cornelia's letters shaped two tribunes, where Cleopatra ruled a kingdom Rome could not simply annex outright for 2 decades, where Livia built an empire's succession out of a garden villa, where Agrippina placed her own dais beside an emperor's throne, and where Galla Placidia, from Ravenna's marshes, held a crumbling empire together for a son too young to hold it himself. One more woman belongs briefly in this same room before we close. Centuries after Galla Placidia, in the city of Alexandria that Cleopatra once ruled, a philosopher and mathematician named Hypatia taught, wrote, and advised the city's Roman governor directly, in a period when the empire's relationship to knowledge itself was changing as fast as its relationship to its gods, until a mob, in a moment of political and religious upheaval far from her own making, ended her life in the street. She too belongs in this room, even without a chapter of her own. None of these women held the offices Rome reserved for its men. All of them, in ways this series has tried to hold honestly rather than flatter, changed the shape of what Rome became anyway. There is no need to carry any of this with you when you go. The women in these rooms have waited 2,000 years to be listened to properly. They can wait now for you to simply rest. Let the story settle. Let Rome and the women who quietly built and rebuilt it from just outside its own front door be enough for tonight to close your eyes to.